Story 1. The man inside my house, the bedroom door. I woke up a little after 2 in the morning because of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, I didn't even open my eyes. The house made noises sometimes, and my first thought was that someone in the family had gotten up to use the bathroom or get a drink. I lay there for a few seconds listening to the slow movement across the floor. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I remember looking at the clock beside my bed. It was 2:07 a.m. The house had become completely quiet, and for several seconds I just stared toward the dark outline of the bedroom door. Then the doorknob moved very slowly, almost as if someone was testing it. It only turned slightly before stopping. I stayed completely still, waiting to hear a voice or some explanation. Nothing came. The reason that moment still bothers me is because there wasn't anyone else living there. I had been alone in that house for nearly a month, and looking back, the signs had started appearing weeks earlier. Normal life after divorce. A few weeks before that night, I had moved into a small rental house on the edge of town after my divorce. The separation itself had been difficult, but by the time I moved out, most of the arguments and stress were already behind us. I was mostly dealing with the strange feeling of starting over at 38 years old and learning how to live by myself again. The house wasn't anything special. It had 2 bedrooms, an old hallway that connected every room, and a kitchen that looked out onto the backyard through a large window above the sink. The bedroom door was older than the rest of the house and never closed properly unless you pushed it hard. There was a small laundry room near the back entrance and a wooden porch that faced the yard. At first, the silence bothered me. After years of sharing a home with someone else, every room felt unusually empty. I kept the television on most evenings, simply to hear another voice in the house. I would usually stay awake until midnight watching old shows, then lock the doors and head to bed. My mornings became predictable. I made coffee before work, stood near the kitchen window while the coffee brewed, and watched the neighboring houses slowly wake up. On weekends, I sat on the back porch for a while before doing laundry or cleaning the house. Over time, I became comfortable with the quiet. The house started to feel safe. I knew every sound the air conditioner made, every creak in the hallway floor, and every loose cabinet door in the kitchen. Looking back now, I think that sense of comfort is what made the first warning signs so easy to ignore. The first strange thing I noticed was a kitchen cabinet that had been left open. It happened one morning while I was making coffee before work. One of the upper cabinets was hanging open several inches, and I remember standing there trying to remember whether I had forgotten to close it the night before. It didn't seem important, so I shut it and went to work. A few days later, I came home and found the back door unlocked. I almost convinced myself that I had simply forgotten to lock it before leaving. The lock itself worked perfectly, and nothing inside the house appeared disturbed. I checked every room out of habit and then let the thought go. Not long after that, I walked into the kitchen late one evening and found the light above the sink turned on. I rarely used that light because it was too bright, especially at night. Still, I assumed I had switched it on earlier and forgotten about it. The thing that bothered me the most was the food. Small things started disappearing from the refrigerator and pantry. The yogurt would be missing. Bread seemed to run out faster than usual. One morning I noticed that several slices of leftover pizza were gone. Living alone after the divorce had already disrupted my routines, so I blamed myself for being distracted. At the time, every explanation felt reasonable. Stress, exhaustion, and forgetfulness seemed more likely than anything else. Looking back now, those small moments were the first signs that something inside the house wasn't quite right, even if I wasn't ready to admit it. Increasing unease. As the days passed, the small things became harder to ignore. Most of them happened late at night, usually after I had already gone to bed. I would hear faint sounds somewhere in the house that didn't seem to belong. Sometimes it sounded like a floorboard settling in the hallway. Other times it was a soft thump that came from the kitchen or the laundry room. At first, I blamed the house itself. The place was old, and older houses always make noises. Still, I began waking up more often during the night just to listen. Every sound seemed to disappear the moment I focused on it. Around that same time, I started noticing that certain items were no longer where I had left them. The television remote would be sitting on the opposite end of the couch. A chair in the kitchen had been moved slightly away from the table. Once I found a pair of shoes near the back door, even though I was certain I had left them in my bedroom. One morning before work, I walked into the bathroom and noticed that the towel hanging beside the sink felt damp. I had showered the previous evening, so I told myself it was probably still wet. But the towel felt freshly used, as if someone had just dried their hands. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 in the morning and found the television on in the living room. I clearly remembered turning it off before going to bed. The screen was playing an infomercial with the volume turned very low. I mentioned some of these things to a friend from work over lunch. He laughed and said I was probably stressed from the divorce and adjusting to living alone. The explanation made sense, and I wanted to believe him. Looking back now, I think that was the point when someone may have already... The night of the footsteps, the night everything changed, started like any other evening. I stayed awake later than usual, watching television in the living room until a little after midnight. Before going to bed, I checked the locks on both doors, turned off the lights, and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. Nothing seemed unusual. Sometime during the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I was still half asleep, and my mind immediately tried to explain what I was hearing. The footsteps were slow and steady, moving along the hallway outside my room. I remember thinking that it sounded like somebody walking carefully, almost as if they were trying not to make noise. I stayed completely still and listened. The footsteps continued for several seconds before stopping directly outside my bedroom door. The silence that followed felt much louder than the sounds themselves. I could hear my own breathing and the ticking of the clock beside my bed.
Ouch.
Then the doorknob moved. It turned slowly, stopping after only a small movement. Whoever was standing outside didn't knock or speak. It simply held the handle for a moment before letting it return to its original position. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I sat there in the darkness, trying to convince myself that I was imagining everything. Several minutes passed before I reached for my phone and called the police. I told the dispatcher that I thought someone might be inside the house. When the officers arrived, they searched every room, checked the doors and windows, and walked through the backyard. According to them, the house was empty. At the time, I wanted to believe they were right, the discovery. The officers were preparing to leave when one of them asked if the house had an attic. I told him there was a small crawl space above the hallway, although I had never gone inside it since moving in. The access panel was located near the laundry room, and when the officer pulled the ladder down, I noticed something strange immediately. The panel was already unlocked. One of the officers climbed up with a flashlight while the other remained downstairs with me. For several seconds, I couldn't hear anything. Then the officer called down and asked his partner to come up. A few minutes later, they showed me what they had found. There were several empty water bottles pushed against the wall. Food wrappers were scattered near the insulation. A blanket had been spread across a section of plywood, creating what looked like a place to sleep. There was also a small flashlight and a few personal items that clearly did not belong to me. The officer told me it appeared that someone had been staying there for some time. The part that still troubles me is where the crawl space was located. It sat directly above my bedroom, meaning that for days, or possibly weeks, someone had been living only a few feet above me. Story 2. Someone was waiting in the parking lot immediate hook. For nearly 2 weeks, there was a man who sat in the same car every night outside my apartment building. The vehicle was always parked near the far end of the lot, facing the entrance, and whenever I came home from work, I could see him sitting behind the wheel. Sometimes the interior light was on, and sometimes it wasn't, but the car was almost always there. At first, nobody thought much about it. People parked in the lot overnight all the time, and I assumed he was visiting someone in the building or waiting for a friend who worked late. After several days, the car simply became part of the scenery. Then one night, I pulled into the parking lot after work and immediately noticed something was different. The car was still there. The headlights were off, and the engine wasn't running, but the driver's seat was empty. I remember slowing down as I walked past it because I suddenly realized I had never actually seen the man leave the vehicle. The problem was that he was nowhere in the parking lot. Daily routine. At the time, I was working evening shifts at a distribution warehouse on the other side of town. Most nights I didn't get home until sometime between 11 and midnight, depending on overtime and traffic. The schedule wasn't ideal, but after several years of doing it, I had become used to the routine. The apartment complex itself always felt safe, wasn't particularly large. Small warning signs. After about a week, I started noticing things that I had ignored at first. The car wasn't just appearing occasionally, it was there every single night. No matter what time I came home from work, the vehicle was parked somewhere in the lot. Sometimes the interior light was on, allowing me to see the driver more clearly. He appeared to be a man in his 40s or 50s, although I never got a good look at his face. Usually sat with both hands resting in his lap, staring toward the apartment buildings instead of looking at his phone or listening to the radio. One evening, I sat in my own car for a few minutes before going inside. I remember noticing that he hadn't moved at all during that entire time. He was simply watching the buildings. The strange part was that the vehicle never stayed in exactly the same parking space. Some nights it was near the entrance. Other nights it sat closer to my building. The changes were small, but I began noticing that the car always seemed to face the apartments. I mentioned it casually to one of my neighbors while we were checking our mail. He shrugged and said the man was probably waiting for someone. Another neighbor thought he might be a rideshare driver taking breaks between trips. Nobody seemed worried. Because everyone else appeared comfortable, I convinced myself that I was overthinking it. Looking back, I think that was the first time I felt something was wrong. Even though I couldn't explain exactly why the sight of that parked car had started to bother me, escalation. After that, I started noticing the man outside of the car. The first time happened on a Saturday afternoon when I walked to the mailboxes near the entrance of the complex. As I reached for my key, I saw him standing several feet away, looking through the community bulletin board beside the mail area. He didn't say anything, simply glanced in my direction before walking away toward the parking lot. At the time, I assumed he might actually live there, and that I had simply never seen him outside the vehicle before. A few nights later, after coming home from work, I took a trash bag to the dumpsters behind the buildings. The area was poorly lit, except for a single overhead light. As I approached, I noticed someone standing near the fence beside the dumpsters. It was him. He wasn't doing anything unusual, wasn't holding anything or acting aggressively. He simply stood there for a few seconds before walking back toward the parking lot without saying a word. The encounters continued over the next several days. Once I saw him walking slowly along the sidewalk that connected the buildings. Another time he was standing near the vending machines outside the laundry room. Every appearance felt ordinary on its own, yet something about it unsettled me. I began paying attention to where his car was parked each night. Sometimes it sat closer to my building than before. Other nights it remained near the entrance. I could never tell whether I was imagining the pattern or not. Whenever I felt uneasy, I reminded myself that he had never actually threatened me. He had never spoken to me, followed me, or done anything that would justify calling the police. Plenty of people walk around apartment complexes at night. I even discussed it again with a coworker, who laughed and said I was becoming paranoid because of my late shifts and lack of sleep. Looking back, I think I wanted other people to tell me I was overreacting, because accepting the alternative and admitting that the man who sat in that car every night might have been paying attention to much more than the apartment buildings. The empty car. The night that finally frightened me started like every other workday. I left the warehouse a little before 11 and stopped for gas on the way home. The drive was quiet, and I remember thinking about nothing more than getting inside my apartment and going to bed. As I turned into the parking lot, I immediately noticed the familiar car. It was parked beneath one of the security lights near my building. The engine was off and the headlights were dark, but something felt different before I even parked my own vehicle. The driver's seat was empty. I sat in my car for several seconds staring at it. For nearly 2 weeks, every time I had seen that vehicle, the man had been inside. Suddenly, for the first time, he wasn't there. That was the moment I realized something that had never occurred to me before. I had no idea where he lived, whether he lived there at all, or where he went when he wasn't sitting in that car. I stepped out and looked around the parking lot. The sidewalks were empty. The mailboxes were dark. The dumpsters sat at the far end of the property and nobody was standing near them. The walk to the staircase felt much longer than usual. Every shadow near the building suddenly seemed important. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone walking across the lot. For the first time, I was no longer afraid of the man sitting in the car. I was afraid because I didn't know where he was. The encounter I had almost reached the top of the staircase when I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow and steady, coming from somewhere below. At first I told myself it was probably another resident coming home late, but something made me stop before reaching my apartment door. The footsteps stopped too. For a few seconds, everything became completely quiet. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the stairs, and I could hear traffic somewhere in the distance. I finally turned around. The man from the car was standing several steps below me. He wasn't moving. His hands were at his sides, and he was simply looking in my direction. Because of the lighting, I couldn't clearly see his face. What frightened me most was that he didn't seem surprised to see me there. Neither of us spoke. After what felt like several seconds, I turned back toward my apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside as quickly as I could. I locked the deadbolt immediately and stood there listening for movement outside. The next morning, I contacted the police and gave them the license plate number I had written down earlier that week. A few days later, an officer informed me that the plates attached to the vehicle were fake. After that, the car never returned. Story 3. The voice in the house opening fear. The first time I heard someone say my name, I answered without thinking. It was late in the evening, and the voice came from somewhere downstairs. It sounded completely normal, like someone calling me from the kitchen or the living room. I remember saying, "Yeah," almost immediately. No one answered. For a few seconds, I sat at my desk waiting to hear the voice again. The house became completely quiet. I could hear my computer fan, the air conditioner turning on, and the faint sound of traffic outside, but nothing else. At first, I assumed I had imagined it. The voice had sounded familiar, almost like one of my parents calling me from downstairs. The problem was that both of them had left that morning to spend the weekend visiting relatives several hours away. I was completely alone in the house. I checked my phone to see whether either of them had called me, but there were no notifications. Looking back, I think the reason the moment stayed with me wasn't the voice itself. It was how natural it sounded, as if somebody downstairs genuinely expected me to answer. Family home. At the time, I was still living with my parents while attending college and working part-time. Every few months they would travel out of town to visit relatives, and I would stay behind to look after the house. I had done it several times before, so being alone for a weekend never seemed unusual to me. Our house was larger than most homes in the neighborhood. It had 2 floors, a long hallway downstairs, and several rooms that rarely got used. The kitchen connected to the dining room, and the staircase sat near the front entrance. My bedroom was upstairs at the end of the hall, which gave me a lot of privacy. The morning my parents left, everything felt completely normal. They packed their bags, reminded me to lock the doors at night, and said they would return on Sunday evening. After they drove away, I spent most of the afternoon cleaning my room and playing video games. My evenings followed the same routine every time I had the house to myself. I would make something simple to eat, sit downstairs watching television for an hour, and then head upstairs with snacks and drinks for the rest of the night. The quiet never bothered me. In fact, I enjoyed having the entire house to myself. Around midnight, I usually sat at my computer playing games or watching videos while the rest of the house remained dark. Occasionally, I would walk downstairs for water or check that the doors were locked before returning to my room. Because I had spent my entire life in that house, I knew every sound it made. I knew which steps creaked, which doors stuck during the summer, and how the air conditioner sounded when it turned on. The house always felt familiar and safe. That is probably why hearing my name from downstairs unsettled me so much. Nothing else had seemed wrong that evening, and I had been completely comfortable being alone. Looking back, that moment felt like the first small crack in something that had always made me feel secure. Strange occurrences after hearing my name that first night. I tried to convince myself that I had simply been tired. I stayed upstairs for another hour before finally going to bed, and by morning the experience already felt less important. Since nothing else had happened, I assumed my mind had played a trick on me. Over the next couple of days, however, I started noticing small things that felt slightly unusual. Late in the evenings, I would hear floorboards creaking somewhere downstairs. The sounds were never loud, and our house had always settled at night, especially when the temperature changed. Even so, I found myself stopping what I was doing just to listen. Once, while walking through the hallway upstairs, I noticed that my parents' bedroom door had shifted open several inches. I clearly remembered closing it earlier that day, but I assumed the air conditioner had moved it. The kitchen also seemed noisier than usual. I occasionally heard what sounded like dishes lightly touching each other, or cabinets making soft sounds. Every time I went downstairs to check, nothing appeared out of place. Our dog started behaving differently as well. He normally slept near my bedroom, but several times I noticed him sitting near the staircase, staring toward the lower floor. He never barked or growled. He simply watched the darkness for several minutes before returning upstairs. One evening, I also noticed that the light above the kitchen sink had been switched on. I was fairly certain I had turned it off earlier, but I dismissed it immediately. Looking back now, none of these things seemed serious on their own. Houses make noises, doors move, and people forget things. That was the explanation I continued giving myself, even though a small part of me had already started wondering whether something else was inside the house with me. The voice returns. For the next couple of nights, nothing happened. The house returned to normal, and I slowly stopped thinking about the voice. I continued following the same routine, staying upstairs until late and checking the doors before going to bed. Part of me felt embarrassed for being unsettled by something I couldn't even explain. Then, several nights later, I heard my name again. It happened a little after midnight, while I was sitting at my computer. I had headphones resting around my neck, and the room was quiet except for the sound of the game I was playing. Suddenly, I heard someone say my name from somewhere outside my bedroom. This time, the voice sounded much closer. I froze immediately. There was no confusion about what I had heard. The voice was clear, calm, and familiar. It sounded very similar to my mother. Not exactly the same, but close enough that my first reaction was to assume she had somehow returned home early. I stood up and listened. The hallway outside my room was completely dark. The upstairs was silent. For several seconds, I waited to hear footsteps or another voice, but nothing happened. What frightened me most was how ordinary it sounded. There was no anger in the voice and no attempt to scare me. It sounded like someone calling me from another room because they needed something. I slowly walked to the top of the staircase and looked downstairs. The living room lights were off, and the kitchen was dark. Every room appeared empty. For the first time that weekend, I felt genuinely afraid. The voice had sounded too real to ignore, and I knew with complete certainty that nobody in my family was inside the house. That was the moment I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. Searching the house for several minutes, I remained at the top of the stairs without moving. Part of me wanted to return to my bedroom, lock the door. The final discovery, I called my parents that night and asked them to come home early. By the following afternoon, they had returned, and we contacted the police to report what had happened. I felt embarrassed describing the voice because I knew how strange it sounded. But the officer listened carefully and asked several questions about the unlocked window and the open gate. A few days later, we received an unexpected call. The officer explained that there had been several reports from nearby neighborhoods involving someone entering homes through unlocked doors or windows. In most cases, nothing had been stolen. The person appeared to leave before being discovered. What disturbed me most was hearing that a few residents had reported hearing voices inside their homes late at night. Some believed they had heard family members calling their names. Others reported hearing someone speaking from another room before finding the house empty. The police never confirmed whether the incidents were connected. Even now, I still don't know whether someone was actually inside our house that weekend. Maybe the unlocked window and open gate had innocent explanations. But whenever I think about that voice calling my name from downstairs, it still sounds close enough to make me wonder if someone was standing there waiting for me to answer. I thought I was alone. When I look back at all three of these stories, the thing that stays with me isn't the moment when the fear finally arrived. It isn't the sound of footsteps outside a bedroom door, a man standing on a staircase, or the voice coming from downstairs.
Ow!
Those moments were frightening, but they weren't the part that lasted. What stayed with each person was the realization that the warning signs had been there much earlier. The man living above the bedroom didn't appear overnight. There were open cabinets, missing food, lights left on, and doors that seemed slightly different than before. None of those things felt important until afterward. The man in the parking lot was visible every single night. People walked past him, drove past him, and accepted his presence because he slowly became part of the routine. The fear only began when the car was still there and the driver was gone. The voice inside the house wasn't the first strange thing either. There were floorboards, moving doors, unusual sounds, and a dog staring into empty rooms. Every detail seemed ordinary until they were connected together. That may be what makes experiences like these so unsettling. Danger rarely announces itself immediately. It often arrives quietly and blends into everyday life. A hallway outside a bedroom, a parked vehicle beneath a security light, a kitchen light left on, an unlocked window, a voice calling your name from another room. Most people ignore those things because they have reasonable explanations. Houses make noise. People forget to lock doors. Cars belong to neighbors. Voices are imagined. The ordinary explanations are usually the ones we choose because they allow us to feel safe. But sometimes, looking back, the ordinary details become the things we remember most. Tonight, when you walk through your own house, park outside your apartment, or hear a familiar sound after everyone else has gone to sleep, you may think about these stories. You may notice the quiet hallway, the empty parking lot, or the light you don't remember leaving on. And perhaps that is the real fear. The most terrifying part isn't realizing someone is there. It's realizing they may have been there long before you noticed.